And there's the beep. So I just want to cover the tapeworm life cycle, and the first part of this is going to be review its material. We covered yesterday, tapeworms are gut parasites, and the eggs will pass out in feces. They may pass out in the form of intact proglottids or even whole sections of multiple proglottids, or the proglottids may break up and the eggs may pass out singly. It depends. The eggs have to get swallowed by an intermediate host. The intermediate host gets tapeworms either by directly eating feces or eating fecal contaminated food. The eggs hatch into oncosphere larvae. Those are the ones that we compared to Jigglypuff meets Freddy Krueger. And those will travel through the body and form a larval type called a metacestode. And there's actually lots of different metacestode types. And most of what I'm going to cover today is different varieties of metacestode. As I mentioned, there's a few species that have freely swimming larvae called Coracidia, which is analogous to the Miracidia larvae that we talked about in flukes. But most don't even have this. And in many species, there may be more than one intermediate host, and the metacestodes may actually pass from the first intermediate host to the second. Eventually, the definitive host eats the intermediate host. So you typically get tapeworms by eating food with a metacestode in it. And the metacestodes hatch and develop into adults, and it's the circle of life. This is actually some eggs that I hope we're going to see in about 3 weeks. Those are eggs of, oh, good grief, which species are we going to get? This is a species that this is Hymenalepis diminuta. The definitive host is rats, and proglottids break up, so you can isolate single eggs from rat feces, and you can actually buy rat feces infected with Hymenalepis these days, because isn't it amazing? And this is what you'll see. That innermost circle is the actual embryo, and out of focus you can see some of those claws that it has. Surrounding that, you have the inner, you have the embryophore membrane. That's that little thin black border around that central circle, the embryo itself. The inner envelope is the inner part of the next circle out. The outer envelope surrounds that, and then that darker brown shell around the whole thing is the coat. And the inner envelope is actually part of the embryo itself, analogous to the way the placenta in mammals is technically part of the embryo. It's from embryonic cells. The outer envelope and the coat is derived from the parent. As hopefully we'll get to see in a while, it takes mechanical breakage and also enzyme activity to digest through all of this. The embryos can tear their way out of all of this, but host digestive enzymes do a lot of the work in breaking all of that down. And out pops Jigglypuff Krueger right there, sometimes called a hexacanth larva, meaning 6 spine, alternately called an oncosphere. Onco means a hook. The medical specialty that treats cancer is called oncology, because cancer is seen as something that gets its hook in you, like a crab, which is what cancer means in Latin, because they thought of it as being like some sort of animal that dug in and got its hooks in you. Anyway, so when an intermediate host eats tapeworm eggs, the hexacanth larvae tear their way out of the egg. They emerge like this. and they'll use those hooks and also enzymes secreted by penetration glands to claw their way out of the intermediate host gut and into the host body cavity or into a major organ. Sometimes they might crawl or be transported a considerable distance. We'll see what the effects of that can look like at the very end. Incidentally, in this picture, you can see the 6 hooks. If you look in up at the top, right in the middle, between that inmost pair of hooks, you can see the penetration gland, that tube right there. That secretes enzymes that help the hexacanth claw its way, tear its way out of the gut. Some species, the egg hatches into a coracidium. There's a coracidium over there in G. Over in figure H, the hexacanth emerges out of the coracidium. So this thing hatches with a ciliated epidermis, but it shucks it off and uses that new syncytial epidermis. You can actually see the syncytial epidermis in this picture if you look carefully at the outermost layer. You can tell that there's no cell divisions to it. It's more or less a continuous sheet of protoplasm. And I can even see the cytons that are connected to it. They're shaded in white with light gray nuclei. Right, so there's a coracidium. And if a species has a coracidium, the hexacanth develops into a procercoid. This is a copepod. That's in this case, it's a freshwater crustacean. There's plenty of marine ones as well. And much of the body cavity of this guy is taken up with a procercoid. Those little blobs on it, I think, are just commensal protists or something like that. But there's a big kind of darker brown, more or less football-shaped looking thing inside this copepod. That's the procercoid. And then the procercoid will develop into another type of larva, a pleracercoid, if the crustacean gets eaten by a fish. And then if the fish gets eaten by a definitive host, the pleracercoid will develop into an adult tapeworm. The pleracercoid can actually be passed up the food web. So if a small fish eats a crustacean, it'll get a pleracercoid. And then if a larger fish eats the smaller fish, the large fish gets the pleracercoid all the way until you get to the definitive host. This is how Diphyllobothrium develops. That's the one that you can get from eating infected salmon that was illustrated by that Japanese painting from 1850 that showed somebody with a bunch of proglottids coming out of his rectum. Rectum? Damn near killed him. Sorry, some punchlines don't really need the rest of the joke. I think this is what my dad sees because he goes fishing a lot now that he's retired. I guess not so much these days, but whenever he can, he goes down to the Gulf of Mexico and fishes for a Gulf of Mexico species called black drum, which is quite delicious. But any black drum above a certain size has what looks like white worms in the flesh. And as long as you cook your fish, they're not harmful. But usually drums that are big enough to have these white worms, he throws back because once they get above a certain size, apparently they don't taste their best. They're fun to catch, but he doesn't keep them. But anyway, I believe those white worms that he finds in his black drum when he's cleaning them are actually pleracercoids. I do know they're a larval stage of a tapeworm, And the definitive host in that case, I'm not sure if it would be a marine mammal or if it would be a cetacean like a dolphin. There aren't any seals in that part of the world, none to speak of, so I'm assuming it's a marine mammal, and that the original host of Diphyllobothrium was marine mammals. Anyway, if you ever get to go fishing for black drum in the Gulf of Mexico, you might spot tapeworm larvae that I think are pleurocercoids if you go clean your catch. Never let it be said I don't teach anything useful. In species that don't have an aquatic stage, the hexacanth digs through the body, and in the case of pork tapeworm, also beef tapeworm, which is in the same genus, the larvae form infective cysticerci in pig muscle. So up at the top, you've got some pork with a bad case of the measles. This is what meat inspectors look for. Too many of those little white round dots mean tapeworm infection. Each one of those is a cysticercus, and each cysticercus has a scolex, right? That's the little head of the tapeworm that usually has attachment organs. In this case, it's hooks and suckers. So down below, that's a complete cysticercus. It's basically just a little blob of filled with fluid. But inside, there's a scolex and a neck that's tucked inside. When the cysticercus is swallowed, it breaks open. The scolex pops right out, attaches to the host intestinal wall, and grows into an adult tapeworm. In some species, the hexacanth develops into a cinereus. This is a cinereus that was removed from the eye of a child from Uganda. This is the cinereus of Taenia multiceps, in the same genus as the pork and the beef tapeworms, Taenia solium and Taenia saginata. But multiceps usually goes from rabbits to dogs. But evidently this child had eaten undercooked rabbit. The hexacanths had hatched in that poor kid's gut, torn their way through his intestine and wandered through the body, and evidently one of them ended up in the kid's eye. And a cinereus is like a cysticercus, but instead of just one scolex on the inside, there's many. And if this gets eaten by the definitive host, every scolex can grow into a tapeworm. So if that poor kid had gotten eaten by a dog, or if a rabbit that had one of these things got eaten by a dog, which is the way things would normally go, then every one of those little whiter spots that you see in the cinereus could grow into an adult tapeworm. And it gets worse. The hexacanth can sometimes develop into a hydatid. The hydatid has a whole lot of cysts called brood capsules budding from the inner germinal layer, and each one of those cysts develops many scolices. So a hydatid looks like a sphere that contains a lot of cinereae, each of which contains many scolices, all budding from the inside. And if you look on the bottom, you can see that those brood capsules eventually burst. And at the bottom of a hydatid, you have what's called hydatid sand. Each one of those grains of what looks like sand is in fact a scolex. So every one of those little sand grains is potentially able to infect any critter that eats this hydatid, as part of, eating or scavenging its prey. And there's a close-up of that hydatid sand. Each one of those little specks is a little free-floating scolex that can grow into an adult tapeworm, given the chance. So what does having one of these things do to people? If you were to eat infected meat with cysticerca, infected pork or infected beef, or contaminated food, you'd get adult tapeworms living in your gut. And I think I told you the story I read. It's in a book about parasitology called New Guinea Tapeworms and Jewish Grandmothers. Worth a read if you get the chance. And if memory serves, one of the cases talked about in the book was a sweet little old Jewish lady who kept very strict kosher and ended up with a pork tapeworm, which sounds like it shouldn't be possible, but it turned out that the deli where she was getting her meat was also butchering pork and wasn't being careful about cleaning their utensils, which meant that she was unknown to herself eating food that was contaminated with pork tapeworm cysticerca, which violates kosher law and also the Department of Health. Now, cysticerca used to be packed and sold as a weight loss aid because if you get tapeworms, they absorb a lot of your food. Remember, they've got no gut, so they just have to absorb directly through that tegument, and they'll soak up quite a lot of it, and so you can eat quite a lot and still lose weight. You don't actually want to do this. They're not the miracle weight loss aid that this ad would suggest, because tapeworms happen to be very, very good at absorbing not just nutrients in general, but specifically your vitamin B12. If you don't have enough of that, you can end up with anemia and neuropathy, nerve symptoms, numbness or tingling in your fingers and toes, that sort of thing. So you do not actually want to have a tapeworm, no matter how badly you want to lose weight. It really isn't safe. Tyra Banks actually promoted the tapeworm diet on her talk show back about 11 years ago. And I'll add this, I don't have a slide for it. The claim has been made that, before the advent of modern medicine and things like that, pretty much everybody had parasites at some point. And the idea is that our immune systems are adapted to this, that, the environment that we evolved in, we always had parasites, and our immune system was strong enough to usually not let them damage us too badly. And the thinking is that now that we live in much more sterile environments where we have, sewage treatment and food inspection and things like that, particularly we in the West, don't get parasites very often. You can't, most of us will probably live and die without ever having a tapeworm at all, and this is seen as a very good thing. But the suggestion is that we have an immune system that's evolved to counter a parasite threat and now has no parasites to fight. And the idea is that this is a reason why we have such a high incidence of autoimmune diseases, that it's the immune system attacking our own body because it doesn't have any of the targets that it evolved to attack. So we have a high incidence of things like rheumatoid arthritis and lupus, various other ills of modern life. And it has been proposed, and it's actually gone into clinical trials, that you can treat autoimmune diseases with a careful and controlled infection with parasites. Obviously, you don't want to hit people with too many, but a couple of tapeworms, or people have also used a nematode parasite called hookworm that we'll talk about later. The idea is that infecting someone deliberately with low numbers hopefully sets up a self-limiting infection that's not going to get bad, it won't have many symptoms, and that it supposedly will help autoimmune diseases. Now, don't try this at home. It is illegal to sell parasites, eggs or larvae for the purpose of infecting somebody. I know that there was a clinical trial a couple of years ago, and the results seem promising. I'm not enough of an immunologist to evaluate whether it would work or not work. It seems to make sense to me, but I am not an expert in the field. And I certainly don't want to, I don't want to recommend medical treatments at all. That's not the kind of doctoral degree that I have, right? I am technically a doctor, but I'm not the kind that does people any good. So I've had students in the past get really interested in this sort of thing. And all I can tell you is it sounds plausible to me, but it's still kind of fringy, and I don't think it's been adequately tested. Nonetheless, it might be something to keep in mind. Maybe this will end up becoming an accepted treatment for autoimmune diseases. You never know. But don't get tapeworms so that you can lose weight. It's not worth it. And you really don't want to get tapeworm eggs in your body. Remember, if you eat cystis cerci of a pork or a beef tapeworm, you get the adults growing in your body. The eggs are supposed to pass out of your body and enter the body of a cow or a pig. Tapeworms like that are particularly common in areas where human waste is used as fertilizer, or is not otherwise disposed of and may end up contaminating grass or whatever you're slopping the hogs with. If you get eggs in your own body, right, if you try to act as the intermediate host, then the eggs hatch into hexacanth larvae. They tear holes in your gut. They start wandering through your body, and they can end up in your muscle. If they do that, then unless you happen to get eaten by somebody else, like if you fall victim to cannibals and get made into sushi, somebody could get infected from you. Since that's extremely rare, what's likely to happen is they'll just sit there in your muscle until your body eventually causes them to calcify. And you'll end up with little calcified cystis cerci in your muscles. If it's a few, it's not that bad, but if there's many, you could have problems with muscle function. But they could also end up in places other than your muscle. This is a section to the brain of somebody with cysticercosis. This person swallowed a lot of tapeworm eggs, probably from eating feces-contaminated food, and ended up with a lot of little tapeworm hexacanth larvae tearing their way out of his gut, wandering through his tissues, and ending up in the brain in this case. So every one of those little holes with a little ball inside is a cysticercus larva. Each one of these could infect a definitive host if that definitive host ate this person's brain raw. So if this person got attacked by a zombie that ate the person's brain, then the zombie could maybe end up with tapeworms in the zombie's gut. Ew, I think I'm going to stop there. But yeah, if you eat tapeworm eggs and you become the intermediate host, they can crawl through all parts of you and cause cysticercosis, cystis cerci forming in brain, muscle. I've seen it in kidneys. I've seen it in liver. They can end up in a lot of places where you really don't want parasites crawling around. And it can get worse. Way back, I showed you some echinococcus. That's a common dog tapeworm, and it's only got a few proglottids. It's very short. And the adult tapeworms would live in dogs, and then I forget what the intermediate host would be. But if you consume eggs of Echinococcus, possibly by eating, vegetables that are contaminated with dog feces, or I'm told fox feces. If you have wild foxes running through your garden and, they take a poop in it and the eggs get washed around and then maybe get onto your vegetables and you don't wash them off, you get Echinococcus eggs, those hatch into larvae, and the larvae crawl through your body and form hydatids, those big fluid-filled structures that have the cysts inside, each one of which produces many scolices. This you have to go in and surgically remove. And I've never done it myself, not being a brain surgeon, but I've seen footage of it done. YouTube used to have a video showing the removal of a hydatid cyst, and it turns out it's really tricky because the fluid inside, if it spills out, causes a massive allergic reaction. You really do not want anaphylactic shock in your brain. That's one place where you never want anaphylaxis, but this is particularly dangerous. And the wall is extremely thin, so you're basically getting a fluid-filled balloon made of something not a whole lot stronger than tissue paper, and you can't let it rupture or you potentially kill the patient. So doing the actual surgery to get one of these out turns out to be a pretty tricky business. So my advice is wash your produce. Try not to eat Echinococcus eggs if you can possibly avoid it, because damn, you end up with you need, I guess we could say that you need a hydatid cyst, like you need a whole. Right. I will go ahead and stop the recording. And once I've stopped the recording, we can cut us.